Our next presenter is Sandra Dunphy, Director of Compliance Services for Weaver and Tidwell. She's had over 25 years of experience working with all types of energy companies around the world. Her specialty area is working with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on compliance and fuel consulting for petroleum and renewable fuel industries. She's here to explain what is RIN and why should you care. Sandra?
Good morning, or we're getting close to afternoon almost now. This is my first time here. I want to thank all of the agencies who are putting this on today. I love to present here because we use a lot of abbreviations in the work that I do, and you all are so familiar with abbreviations, all the initial agencies. You'll understand all of this really well. I'm going to give you an overview of the RFS program, the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. So how many of you in here know what a RIN is? Raise your hand, please. Well, that's pretty good. How many of you wish you never heard of a RIN? Same people. Okay, good. That's kind of what I thought. Usually when I give a presentation and I say, how many of you have ever heard of RIN? You know, almost everybody raises their hand and they look around at those few people who have never heard of it and they go, you are so lucky. But I'm going to try to take the pain out of RINs today as much as possible. I'm going to give a little bit of overview about Weaver. Most of you probably have never heard of Weaver and Tidwell. We're an independent accounting firm, the largest in the Southwest. We are a typical full-service accounting firm, have been in business more than 60 years with accounting, audit, and tax functions. And you might say, well, what is this engineer doing working for that on part of EPA compliance? But we have a small energy compliance practices group, and we specialize in fuel regulations, both gasoline, diesel, and now the RFS program. And so we're based in Texas. We do have one office in Connecticut, and we have another small office in Denver, Colorado. So we're going to go over what RFS is, what RINs are, and I'm going to try make it as simple as possible. You know, I've often been asked to speak on a panel where people are talking about different things, and I'm assigned to talk about RFS. And they'll say, and I'll say, how many minutes do I have? And they'll say, oh, about 5 minutes. Now, those of you who know anything about the RFS program know that that just cannot happen. I mean, all I can basically say is the RFS is really complicated, and if you have questions, come see me. But today I'm going to go through it all. We're going to talk about different sources of renewable fuels, biomass, how RINs work, the famous blend wall. If you haven't heard of the blend wall, you'll be an expert on it when we're done today. Talk about the future. I'm not going to really do any forecasting, but I'm going to talk about what could possibly happen in the future and how what EPA will do in the coming weeks is going to have a significant impact in the U.S. So we started with the Clean Air Act back a long time ago, and then the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which first started the whole renewable fuels moving into the marketplace concept. And we called that first part of the program RFS 1, and it began September 1st of 2007. The goals for introducing renewable fuels into the petroleum marketplace were somewhat modest at the time. We had a goal of 9 billion gallons by 2008. We were already doing 6 billion gallons or thereabouts by the end of 2006 or 2007. So it was a pretty modest goal, but yet it was 22 billion gallons by 2022. The whole concept of RINs were born at that time, and we started trading RINs in September of 2007. And the RINs are produced by renewable fuel producers, and they're used by what we call obligated parties, which are petroleum refiners and importers of gasoline under RFS 1. RINs were 38-digit numbers, and they were transferred amongst oil companies and other participants in the market on Excel spreadsheets. So those of you who use Excel at all know what happens when you put a 38-digit number into an Excel spreadsheet, and it turns into exponential. So these numbers were transferred as text, and many times they were typed in and retyped in. Now realize we were still at about 7 billion gallons, each of those gallons with a 38-digit number. So to say that that was quite the interesting program would be an understatement. In those days, RIN fraud was typographical errors. We've progressed since then. Okay, let me go on to the Energy Independence Act of 2007. We call that ESA. We had the standard goals, reduced dependence on foreign oil, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, increase employment in our green sector in the U.S. And how would we do that? Well, the goals for the RFS program now increased up to 36 billion gallons by 2022, and that was to be made up of different types of renewable fuels, not just ethanol or biodiesel, but it introduced the concept of advanced biofuels, which is anything other than, say, corn ethanol. So it would include biodiesel, and renewable diesel, biogas, and some of these others. And we were to have regulations within 12 months of the Congress passing that. And in February 2010, a little bit more than 12 months, we had the RFS 2 regulations, which began July the 1st. And the biggest difference was all renewable fuels starting that date now had to be made from what's called renewable biomass, which was defined in the ESA, and I have that included in the presentation, and you'll see that in just a minute. We now had, instead of just one single obligation that the refiners of gasoline had to meet, they now have 4 different obligations based on the different types of renewable fuels. And instead of just using gasoline to calculate their obligation, now the program expanded to gasoline and diesel fuel. Okay? So everyone had abbreviations today. Here are my abbreviations. I'm going to use the ones in red most often, so please get familiar with those. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. I've already explained an obligated party. Someone obligated under the RFS program today is a refiner or importer of gasoline or diesel. Okay, that's a very important distinction because we talked today about the increased exports of refined products. Well, if I'm an obligated party and I have an obligation to retire RINs at the end of the year, that obligation is solely based on the gasoline and diesel that I produce. If I produce that fuel and I'm the exporter of that fuel, I get to exclude those volumes from my calculation and don't have to have RINs to cover that portion. So another reason for increased exports is to reduce that RIN obligation or the RIN tax that an oil company or an importer has. I'm going to talk today about the different types of fuel, including biomass-based diesel, which may be a new term to some of you. Basically, that includes renewable diesel and biodiesel. Biodiesel is a methyl ester, and renewable diesel is everything other than methyl esters, and I can explain more later. We're also going to talk about the renewable volume obligation, how that's calculated for a typical oil refiner, and greenhouse gas. We're going to talk about that in terms of the reduction in greenhouse gases for given types of renewable fuels. So, you may have seen this slide before. This is what the RFS program looks like starting from 2009 going all the way to 2022. So what you'll notice about this slide is that when Congress passed the ESA, they set forth a fixed and constantly increasing volume of renewable fuels to be blended into our transportation, heating oil, and jet fuel pools. Okay, most of that goes into transportation fuel, a certain amount goes into heating oil, and very tiny amounts go into jet fuel today. So this is different than programs in, say, Europe or Canada, where they introduced renewable fuels on a percentage basis. This is introduced on a fixed volume per year, constantly increasing basis, although it was anticipated, or really kind of anticipated, that gasoline and diesel demand would continue to increase over this period of time, and what's happened is gasoline demand has decreased since 2007 when the program began, and hence that has created what we call the blend wall, and I'll be talking more about that. So you can see that corn ethanol, which is our standard renewable fuel under RFS 1, is capped out under this program at 15 billion gallons a year. We're currently at about 13.8, the standard for this year in 2013, and that moves up to 15. Everything above that is an advanced biofuel. And so that includes cellulosic fuels. And cellulosic fuels, if you want to think of, let's think of corn, instead of using the kernel, you would be using the husk, switchgrass, wood chips, all of that falls under cellulosic feedstocks. Biodiesel is the green category there. That was set forth by Congress to be at least 1 billion gallons per year moving forward. But each year, EPA makes a determination whether that number should be higher than that. This year, our standard is 1.28 billion gallons. I might add that some renewable fuels, you make more than 1 RIN per gallon if you're a producer of that type of fuel. So the number of RINs you make per gallon is determined by the BTU content of that fuel relative to ethanol. So if I make corn ethanol, I make 1 corn ethanol RIN per gallon. If I make biodiesel, I actually make 1.5 D4 biomass-based diesel type RINs for every gallon. So that's taken into consideration when we do these standards. Each of these fuels also has to meet a certain greenhouse gas reduction versus the petroleum fuel that it displaces. So corn ethanol facilities have a minimum 20% greenhouse gas reduction. The exception to that were grandfathered facilities that already were in operation in 2007. They are grandfathered to their baseline or their volume as of 2007 and did not have to meet the 20%. But a new ethanol plant does have to meet the 20% greenhouse gas reduction when looking at the type of feedstock, in the process and the fuel that is made. So all of these fuels, you can see cellulosic has to meet a 60% greenhouse gas reduction and the other advanced biofuels a 50% reduction. Now, on top of this, I've also thrown in our gasoline blend levels. So we're currently at E10 or 10% ethanol blended into gallons of petroleum gasoline. E15 has been approved, and if it was fully implemented, we would hit the E15 blend wall out there in about 2017. And if we take the program out to 2022, about 30% of our gasoline in our tank would be some type of renewable fuel. That's if all other things being equal. And we're going to talk about this some more as I go through. Okay, so there are 4 standards that an obligated party has to meet at the end of the year: cellulosic, biomass-based diesel, advanced, and total renewable. And that's a little hard to read, but the bottom one is total renewable. Now, these are called nested standards, and let me explain that. So let's say I'm an oil company, I'll just say I'm Chevron. I have an obligation based on the amount of gasoline and diesel that I produce each year. And my obligation for cellulosic biofuel is based on the amount of production I make times a percentage that's set by the EPA. And so I have to meet that standard. I also have to meet my biomass-based diesel standard. But my advanced biofuel standard actually includes the other 2 previously mentioned fuels. So where you see the 21 billion gallons, that's actually inclusive of the 16 billion gallons of cellulosic as well as the biomass-based diesel portion. So you can see that advanced biofuel on its own is everything other than that, which could include sugarcane ethanol, biogas, some types of renewable diesel. The advanced biofuel standard is nested inside of the total renewable fuel standard. Now you can see why when I only have 5 minutes to talk about the RFS, I can hardly get through this very first slide. Okay, so the 21 billion gallons of advanced biofuels is nested inside of the total renewable fuels, which leaves 15 billion gallons for corn ethanol, which is the only non-advanced biofuel. Now, each of these types of fuels has a certain code that goes with it, and these D codes are specific to the type of fuel and the pathway that is used. And I think I have a pathway table here. Let me just show that for a second. So this pathway table is included in the RFS regulations. And the pathway table is for the greenhouse gas analysis. So the EPA runs a life cycle analysis for a given type of fuel using a given type of feedstock with a given production process. And that determines its greenhouse gas reduction and the type of RIN that it creates. So here you can see some examples of different types of feedstocks, the fuel that they make, and the process that has been approved by the EPA. And then the greenhouse gas reduction, D code, determines the type of RIN. Okay? So we're going to come back to that in just a second. Okay, so we're on these nested standards, and you can see there's all these different D codes that meet each one of these. And the oil companies collect RINs based on their D code and use them at the end of the year. So in order to achieve the objectives, what has to happen? Well, renewable fuels have to be used either in their neat form, meaning at a basically 100% level, or they can be blended into gasoline, diesel, jet, or heating oil. And who has to ensure that this happens? Well, producers of renewable fuels generate RINs under this program. Blenders of renewable fuels blend the fuels and separate the RINs. Once the RINs are separated, they can move to the obligated parties who have the obligation to use RINs. Now, when I say obligated parties, the oil companies and the oil importers of gasoline and diesel are the only obligated parties under the program. If they don't meet their obligation, they're subject to penalty. If producers don't produce renewable fuel, they are not subject to penalty under the program today. Okay, now, and also an obligated party could also be a blender, as you're probably well aware. There's many oil companies who also blend renewable fuels into the products that they sell. So I'm just talking about producers and importers here, and I've given some examples, ADM, Cargill, and REG. So the producer is the one who the RIN is born at the producer. When he makes a gallon of renewable fuel, he generates at least one RIN for that fuel. And if he's a corn ethanol producer, he generates one. As I said, a biodiesel producer generates 1.5 RINs. RINs can only be generated if the feedstock meets the definition of renewable biomass, which I have on the next slide, and it's used using an EPA-approved pathway, which means that I have to use a certain process that's approved by the EPA and that certain feedstock. RINs can only be generated for fuel that's going to be used in the U.S. So if I'm a producer and I know that my renewable fuel is going to be exported from the U.S., I either have to retire or kill those RINs, or I just don't make them in the first place and I designate that fuel as going out of the country. So likewise, if I'm any type of entity in the U.S. and I buy a renewable fuel and I export that renewable fuel, I have an obligation to kill the RIN, because since the fuel wasn't used in the United States, we didn't achieve the greenhouse gas reduction because of that burning of that fuel. Therefore, all the benefits attributable to it don't accrue to the U.S., and I have to retire that RIN, and it cannot be used by an obligated party for their annual compliance. So, renewable biomass, as defined by Congress, included planted crops and crop residue, trees, tree residue, animal waste materials, and that includes everything like tallow, chicken fat, fish oil, slash and pre-commercial thinnings, wood chips. You can read the rest of this here. Algae, used cooking oil, trap grease, yellow grease, all those types of things can be used to make renewable fuel. I just want to hit on the crops and crop residue. You can see that there's a qualification to crops and crop residue that has to do with the date that the land went into service for producing crops. So in the US and Canada, EPA does an analysis, or has done an analysis, let me start with the US, to determine how much pasture and cropland was devoted to crops and pasture in 2007, and then they do a comparison of today's crop and pasture land each year, and if it's less than 2007, then I, as a producer using a crop, don't have to prove where the corn was grown that makes the fuel. But if I'm outside the US and Canada, Canada also has this exemption now, but if I'm, say, in Europe, and I'm going to make a renewable fuel, or let's take the example of Brazil making sugarcane ethanol. It's a crop. Therefore, in order to make fuel that would get a RIN in the United States, when I ship it to the US, I have to know that the land where the sugarcane was grown was in service or fallow as of that magic date in 2007. I have to have the boundaries of that land, and I have to know how much feedstock came from those specific farms and fields that were used to make the sugarcane. And I have to prove that to EPA every time I generate a batch of RINs. So it is quite the exercise to do a renewable fuel that's based on a crop that's grown outside the US. Okay, we've already been through the examples of pathways, and you can see all of these different D codes. We've heard talk today about propane. Propane's also an approved fuel, but it has to be made from a renewable biomass source. You see that biogas is on here. Some people call that biomethane from landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and that type of thing. That's, no pun intended, one of the hottest pathways today. Because it generates a D5 RIN, and it's approximately 12 RINs per MMBTU. Now, quick math, if you saw that the price of RINs today, you'd be looking at, I don't know, something like $5 per MMBTU, just in RIN value alone for that MMBTU of landfill gas. The trick is that has to be used as either CNG or LNG. It has to be used as a transportation fuel in order to gain a RIN. Earlier this year, when RIN prices were very high, that value was up to $15 per MMBTU in RIN value for biogas that went to the LNG or CNG market. So you can see why that's a very popular pathway right now. Okay, so I just pulled this from the NREL website, and you can see that they do have interactive maps where you can see the different types of biomass, whether it's corn stover or wood chips that are available in the United States or that are produced. I also included biomethane sources, which are the landfills and wastewater treatment plants and the like. And manure digesters, ironically, in brown on the map. Thought that was kind of funny. Then where are the biodiesel and the ethanol plants? Well, here we have the green represent the ethanol plants, primarily in the Midwest, as you would expect, and the blue represents the biodiesel production facilities. So let's talk about blenders. Who are blenders in this program, and how do they fit in? Well, a blender is someone who takes renewable fuel and puts it into gasoline or diesel to create a transportation fuel. That transportation fuel could be, say, 10% ethanol in gasoline. It could be 15% or E85 used in a flex fuel vehicle. For biodiesel, the blends are usually B2, B5, or B20. In most of the U.S. right now, if you went to a truck stop, you would likely see a B20 blend. So 20% biodiesel and 80% ULSD. Many of the blenders are obligated parties. I haven't shown any here. These are some of the non-obligated parties. So here's what happens. They buy clear gasoline, they buy ethanol, they blend it together. The act of blending allows them to separate the RIN, where they can sell two commodities now, E10 at their stations and the RIN back into the marketplace. So they can monetize the RINs. And these companies don't have an obligation to retire RINs at the end of the year because they don't make gasoline or diesel fuel. So for the blenders in this program, RINs have been a nice little bird's nest on the ground. Okay, obligated parties. I've thrown a few examples up there. This is someone who imports or produces petroleum, gasoline, or diesel fuel in a given calendar year. So we've talked about pipelines, natural gas pipelines. They actually turn out to also be obligated parties oftentimes, and that is due to the fact that they blend butane into gasoline to make more gasoline. So they're obligated on the butane portion of their blend. So anytime I take a component and put it with a finished gasoline or diesel, I too have an obligation. But most of the obligated parties are taking crude oil, refining it, and turning it into gasoline or diesel, and that's what makes them obligated. They have to use RINs to comply with the program. So they have two choices on how they get RINs. They can either buy renewable fuel and get the RINs with the renewable fuel, or they can just buy the RINs out in the marketplace from some of the people on the previous slide or anybody else. Who can own a RIN? Any registered EPA entity. So those of you who've read the New York Times article of a month or so ago, even banks now own RINs. Anyone can own a RIN, as long as you're registered with the EPA. So you don't have to be a participant in the market, which does scare a lot of the participants quite a lot. Okay. So what's the life of a RIN? I find that this is kind of helpful to give you an idea of what happens over the course of a RIN's life. So the RIN is born at the renewable fuel producer's facility, and in this case, he's born in May. Let's say I'm a biodiesel producer and now I have made a gallon of biodiesel. It's certified as meeting an ASTM spec. I can now make RINs on that fuel. I make 1.5 D4 biodiesel RINs for every gallon of fuel that I produce. I ship that fuel out into the marketplace. The RIN gets Velcroed to the fuel and out it goes. Not literally, but you know what I mean, okay? And so the person who gets that might be a blender, and they're going to blend that biodiesel into their diesel fuel and sell it out into the market. When they do blend it, they separate the RIN from the fuel so the Velcro comes off. They now sell their blended product, and they have a separated RIN, which is marketable to anyone who's registered with the EPA to own RINs. So usually, the RINs will wind up at an obligated party. And so it's the ExxonMobils and the Chevrons and the Shells and the BP who have to collect these RINs over the course of the year and then retire them after the end of the year to prove that they're in compliance. So Exxon, Shell, and Valero and those companies, a lot of them have retail stores where they have the ability to blend fuels. But there are also what we call merchant refiners. And merchant refiners do not blend renewable fuels into their products because they sell their gasoline and diesel into the marketplace, but through, say, a pipeline or to another entity who then distributes it. Those merchant refiners have to go out and buy RINs in the marketplace to show that they're in compliance because they can't buy the physical fuel and separate the RIN that way. So the obligated party has until the end of the year. A RIN has kind of a 2-year life, so that if the RIN is born in 2013, it can either be used for 2013 compliance or it can be used for 2014 compliance. But an obligated party is limited on how many RINs they can use in the next year, up to 20% of their obligation. So RINs live for 2 years, but in the second year, they usually have a lower value because of their limited use. This is the nesting slide to show you, if I'm an obligated party, how I use my RINs. So let's start with the cellulosic RIN right here. So if I buy a cellulosic RIN, I will use it to satisfy my cellulosic obligation. If it's a D3, that same RIN can be used to satisfy my advanced and my total renewable fuel obligation. If it's a D7, then it's a cellulosic diesel RIN. It's kind of the O positive of RINs. It can either be used to satisfy my cellulosic or my biomass-based diesel obligation, in addition to the advanced and the renewable. Now, in any given year, when there's not enough cellulosic production, which versus what Congress mandated, which has been every year under the program, EPA must make what's called a cellulosic waiver credit, or a paper RIN, available to the obligated parties to use for compliance. So if I'm an oil company, I have a choice. I can use a cellulosic waiver credit, but it cannot be nested. So if I buy this, I still have to buy an advanced or a biodiesel RIN to fill in my loss, okay? That's how RINs work. And this is that nesting concept. Okay, so what have RIN prices done historically? Well, for years, throughout the program, the corn ethanol RINs have been in the pennies range. And all of a sudden, this year, they jump way up. So the line at the very bottom are corn ethanol RINs, and you can see that they reached a high of about $1.43 earlier this year. What caused this? Well, what caused this is kind of the 20%, 80% rule that I just mentioned, where an oil company can use 20% prior year RINs to satisfy my compliance in a given year. When the oil companies came into 2013 and they looked ahead to 2014 at the higher standards, you remember that slide where the standards go up, they were concerned that they would not have enough 2013 RINs to meet 20% of the very high 2014 standard. So they started buying RINs. And that caused this market to go up like crazy. And so the concern there was there really won't be enough RINs to meet compliance. I need to get them right away so that I'm covered. So what you had was the big run-up. Now, because a D4 and a D5 RIN can be used in the D6 or corn category, the corn ethanol RIN is the cheapest RIN. So when it goes up, it pushes all other RIN prices up with it, because I can use a 4 to satisfy my 6 because of the nesting. So when RIN prices do that and corn ethanol prices are forced upward, it pushes all the other prices upward. Today, as of this morning, corn ethanol RIN is back down to about 25 cents. Still way in excess of what it's been in the past, but concerns over the 2014 standards have eased somewhat, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, now that you know what a RIN is, why do you care what a RIN is? How does that affect the marketplace? Well, RIN prices get passed along to the consumer in one way or another. Most ethanol RINs go basically at no cost with the ethanol. So even when the ethanol prices went up to $1.43, the cost of ethanol didn't go up the same amount if I was buying physical ethanol. But in order to buy physical ethanol, I still have to have blending capability. I have to have storage capability, because ethanol can't move in a pipeline the way crude oil does. So I have to get that in rail and trucks, and I have to have storage accordingly. So it's not inexpensive to be able to take ethanol in and move it out through the system. Merchant refiners, as I mentioned, have to pass along the full value of the RIN, because they're not getting the RINs for free, if you will, by buying physical fuel. They're just buying RINs. So for advanced biofuels, the RIN is also embedded, but not to the extent where you get it for free. They actually get a portion of the RIN value in the advanced biofuel. And let's just talk about the blend wall. Okay, so what happens each year is EPA establishes the RVO percentages, so renewable volume obligation, how many RINs an obligated party has to own at the end of the year in order to establish that they're in compliance. This RVO percentage for each of the categories is set forth by the formula or the fraction in the ESA. So the numerator of the fraction is the volume of renewable fuel that either Congress or EPA determines for a given D code in a given year. The denominator of the fraction is gasoline plus diesel projected to be used in the coming year. So if you see that the numerator is constantly increasing, and the denominator, and this is a little bit hard to read, but based on the annual energy outlook in '07, you remember I said that we anticipated that gasoline demand would continue to rise. Unfortunately, this is what it's done, and this is the 2012 forecast, and this is the 2013 forecast. So you have a numerator constantly increasing and a denominator decreasing. And so you don't have to be too mathematically challenged to figure out that that makes the percentages go up every year. And so we hit the blend wall where we hit the 10%. All gasoline has 10% ethanol in it, but yet we have to blend more renewable fuel because that was required by Congress. So this slide basically shows the same thing, where this is the demand and then this is the RFS program. And we crossed that blend wall sometime between 2012 and 2013. So now we've got 10% ethanol in gasoline, but yet we still have this higher obligation to blend renewable fuels. Now, let me go back. So let me just do this slide right here. So almost every gallon in the US has 10% ethanol in it. Again, thank you EIA for this slide. This is through the end of last year, how much gasoline didn't have the full 10% ethanol in it. And you can see it's very hard to find gasoline today without at least 10% ethanol in it. Okay, so we've hit the blend wall, but remember, this is gasoline, and diesel is also in this program. We have not hit the blend wall on the distillate side of the equation. So not every gallon of ULSD has 5% biodiesel or renewable diesel in it. There's still space in that renewable portion to move in. And if I use biodiesel RINs and I blend biodiesel, remember I get 1.5 RINs per gallon, and they can also be used to satisfy my corn shortfall because of the nesting. So when I can't blend enough corn, I can buy advanced RINs, which can be used in the corn category to help me satisfy my obligation. Okay, so what about E15? That seems like a logical answer. Well, from the AAA website, we have it's been kind of a slow rollout of E15, mostly because legacy vehicles, that's another word for old cars, can't really run on E15 very well, and that's cars pre-2001, and according to the EPA studies. According to the AAA, you're in luck if you drive a Porsche, and I'm sure there's just so many people in the US are happy to hear that you don't have to worry about that. But ironically enough, yesterday I saw the Renewable Fuels Association, which is the ethanol people, came out with their own listing of vehicles, and it didn't even mention Porsche. So I'm not sure exactly which one is which, but if you have any doubts as to what your vehicle yourself can run, I suggest you look at the owner's manual or go to the manufacturer's website, because this seems to change every day. Okay, so we talked a little bit, I've heard today, propane and CNG, LNG, E85, the predominance of E85 stations. And let's just talk about what E85 is. It sounds like it's 85% ethanol. It's really not. It can be anything from, say, E15 to E81. Most E85 is about 50% ethanol, 30 to 50% ethanol. So I don't know why they call it E85, because it includes all this mid-range blends. But that's for a flex fuel vehicle. Now, how many people in here drive a flex fuel vehicle? Anybody? Hardly anybody? 1? 2? 3? Okay. Most people, when I mention flex fuel, they go, oh yeah, my car runs on regular or premium also. Okay, flex fuel is not regular or premium. It is E10 or E15 or E85. So do you ever put E85, anything other than E10 in your car? Not yet. Okay, so of all the 10 million E85 flex fuel vehicles out there, they average less than 1 tank full a year of anything other than E10, because they're throughout the United States and the E85 stations are in the Midwest. So we have a little problem trying to get E85 to be bigger and bigger in the marketplace because of our limitation. Again, it's an infrastructure build out. And those pumps usually are separate from all the other pumps at the station to avoid a misfueling problem. Ironically enough, I was given a presentation at the Nebraska Ethanol Board meeting, and the presenter was trying to make an important point about, really drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and using corn ethanol in vehicles. And he said, how many people in this room drove here today in an E85 vehicle? And there was like 25 people raised their hand out of a group of maybe 60 people, and I was pretty impressed with that. And so he said to them, okay, corn people, how many of you, your last tank full was E85? 3 people raised their hand. Now this was Nebraska. I mean, these stations are everywhere. They really have no excuse not to run E85. But it's kind of evidence of problematic is getting people to go out of their way to go to the E85 station. So even in Nebraska and Iowa, they have a hard time selling the E85. Okay. So this is kind of the law of intended and unintended consequences in some ways. Certainly the intended consequence was to displace petroleum, gasoline, and diesel, and that is definitely happening. We've got a lot more renewable fuel production facilities in rural America. The good thing, biodiesel plants can be built almost anywhere when they're using used cooking oil, because we have used cooking oil in many different places. A biogas facility, it can be located near the wastewater treatment plant. Now, they do have to use the CNG or LNG transportation fuel for that biogas, but yet it's really helped to add jobs to the green marketplace. We've achieved greenhouse gas reductions. I'll let people in the room argue whether we have or haven't, but I think that's the idea was that we would do that. And we've seen some pretty cool new technologies where people are taking wood chips and instantaneously making that into gasoline or diesel, a drop-in fuel. We have renewable fuel, renewable diesel, which looks exactly like petroleum diesel. It can be used in cold weather temperatures. It meets all the same specs. In fact, it's even better in cold weather. And that can be made from all kinds of used cooking oil or acid distillate and things like that. Now, what's happened also, the unintended consequences, is when we had the pricing mismatch here between the corn ethanol and the advanced RINs. So here was a corn ethanol RIN in 2012, and the advanced RINs are up in here. So if you have a 50-cent differential in price, does it really surprise you that we were exporting corn ethanol to Brazil and importing sugarcane ethanol? So the ships would pass, not really achieving the greenhouse gas reduction, but it was outside the US, so I guess we didn't worry about it. But anyway, that was kind of a strange phenomenon, and it was all due to the value of the RINs. We've had a lot of exports of gasoline and diesel fuel that was mentioned earlier today. Well, it cost a refiner earlier this year, if I had calculated my total obligation based on the current RIN price, when those RIN prices were very expensive, that came out to about 13 cents for every gallon of gasoline and diesel that I made. That's currently down to about 2.5 cents. But that's quite the tax on every gallon of gasoline and diesel. So I am incented to export because I can exclude those volumes from my calculation and therefore save having to buy those RINs. Food versus fuel, there's not enough time in the day to go all through food versus fuel. But we certainly, one of the ideas was to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, but we kind of increased our dependence on foreign renewable fuel because we had to bring in a lot of sugarcane ethanol in order to meet the standards. And RIN fraud has been a problem where the system is really based on people being honest. You go into the system, you generate a RIN, and you should have generated or produced a gallon of biofuel in order to do that. But some folks didn't do that, and there's been 3 cases, well now 4, of RIN fraud where people have generated RINs and did not have a physical plant. And when you buy Bentleys and Mercedes and they clog the neighborhood, people call the IRS and bad things happen. Okay, so we are currently at a crossroad here. We're at the blend wall. And the blend wall has caused EPA to consider revising the RFS standards downward. Now, they have previously revised the standard downward for cellulosic fuel because we haven't had enough production to meet what Congress mandated. And when they do that, they also have the right to reduce the advanced and the total obligation because of the nesting, but they've never done that in the past. They have assumed that we'd have enough extra advanced biofuel to meet the obligation. Well, we're now at the point where we may not have enough extra biofuel to meet the advanced obligation, and hence the EPA for the very first time is considering lowering all the standards for the coming year. Now, this document was leaked somehow from either OMB or EPA out into the marketplace right before the shutdown. So it's been talked about and talked about. And now I think the EPA will publish the 2014 standards sometime either today or in the next couple of weeks, and people will be able to formally comment upon them, whether they think, yes, this is great, like the oil companies may say, oh my gosh, EPA, you didn't go far enough to reduce these because they're hard enough to meet already. And then the biofuel people are saying, are you kidding me? How can we ever get financing for our plants in the future if you keep lowering these standards? It's going to be very difficult for us. So there's a big battle going on right now. So the difference between where we are today is that in 2013, you can see our standards. ESA had 1 billion gallons of cellulosic fuel as what they put forward in the original legislation. EPA reduced that to 6 million gallons. We've only made about 600,000 gallons so far this year. So cellulosic production is something that is coming. If you saw Back to the Future 2, I know you want to use eggshells and banana peels and stick them in your flux capacitor, but we're just not ready to do that yet. But it's coming. I mean, it's happening, and there's investments that have been made, and people are doing some amazing things with things that you would never normally make a fuel out of. I mean, it's not easy to take lignin and cellulose and turn that into a liquid fuel that can burn in your engine without any problems. So it's happening, it's coming, it's just coming pretty slowly. So we had that reduction this year, but EPA increased the biomass-based diesel obligation from 1 billion gallons to 1.28. And so if you're wondering why that's up there, remember, biodiesel makes 1.5 RINs per gallon. So this is in RINs, okay? So not 1.92 billion RINs. And the biomass-based diesel people this year expect to make at least 1.7 billion gallons. So they're going to far exceed this obligation that that EPA set forth. And so they're kind of saying, wow, we've more than met the standards this year, and yet you're cutting us back next year or keeping us flat. It doesn't recognize all the growth that we've made and all the investment. The advanced biofuel category is 2.75. Remember, that includes the 1.92. It includes the cellulosic. So this is mostly still sugarcane ethanol this year. And keep in mind that under the CARB LCFS standards, sugarcane ethanol is benefited versus Midwest ethanol. So even though next year we may not need that much sugarcane ethanol, it still may come into California because it helps on the LCFS side. Okay, and the total renewable fuel standard, 16.55. You subtract off 2.75 for advanced, and the corn is 13.8. Well, gasoline demand in this country is about 13. So you can see that we exceeded the blend wall this year. In fact, that's at E10. Okay? So in 2014, Congress anticipated that this would be the standards. Of course, this could be adjusted upward by EPA, but look how big this number gets. I mean, the cellulosic jumps up, and you'll remember that very first slide where the blue keeps going up tremendously. Okay, so look at the total volume of renewable fuel is 18 billion gallons versus where we are today. 14.4 of that is supposed to be corn. Okay, so now in the leaked document, EPA has proposed 23 million gallons for cellulosic, because remember, they're also contemplating changing biogas over to cellulosic. And I don't want to get in an argument whether you think that should happen or not, because we could be here a really long time. But the biomass-based diesel, they're proposing keeping at the current rate, the 1.28 billion gallons, equating to 1.92 billion RINs. But look at the advance, what a big chop they made here, 2.21, leaving a mere 300 million gallons or RINs to be made up by either biomass-based diesel or advanced fuels. So those are the people who are really being impacted most by the proposed standards. And then the corn, I think I mentioned a minute ago, we're at about 130 billion gallons of gasoline. That equates to about 13 billion RINs or gallons for ethanol. So that's what EPA has set. And there's a big fight right now over what these things should be. And you'll see a lot of visits to the Hill and to DC. I think I mentioned here on this, the official comment period has yet to begin, but since October 21st, they've had something like 18 different entities already visit either the OMB, the EPA, 84 people. Most of them have represented the biofuel interests, corn, soybeans, et cetera, et cetera. So EPA can adjust these standards. ESA gives them the right if there is severe economic hardship or harm to the environment or to the U.S. economy, or there is inadequate domestic supply. And the waiver period would be 1 year. So EPA in the leaked document has said inadequate domestic supply could not only apply to renewable fuel, but it can apply to the gasoline and diesel that the renewable fuel has to be blended into. So I'm sure the lawyers will have a field day in determining whether EPA has that right or not. But that's what's been proposed. Okay, so what could happen if EPA reduces the standards as proposed? You will see those ethanol RIN prices probably drop down to the pennies level. You'll see that lower advanced biofuel RIN prices they're going to come off, because now it's going to look like those standards are very easy to meet for the advanced biofuel, and those RIN prices will also come down. They may come down to the point where some biodiesel production facilities, especially the smaller non-integrated facilities, and what I mean by that is many biodiesel producers are also large ag companies like ADM and Cargill, who have the soybeans, crush the soybeans, and then make the fuel in the meal. So those who are using, say, cooking oil or whatever may have a difficult time if the standards are reduced. You're going to see these prices come off. In fact, the day that the leaked document kind of became public, soy and corn prices did go down already. Investments in advanced biofuels, I think if it's hard enough to get someone to invest in these cellulosic facilities, but without constant, and consistent policy, it's very difficult to attract investment to that community. Gasoline pump prices haven't really been affected so much by RINs, and you've seen the big run up in RIN prices, but certainly if the RIN prices are depressed next year, you won't see much of an impact on the pump prices. And foreign renewable fuel will have a difficult time coming here because we will already be producing enough. So sugarcane will go down except for maybe in California. So what happens if EPA leaves the standard and only reduces cellulosic like they've done this year? Well, RIN prices will definitely move upward because if we go back to what ESA was, you saw the reaction at the beginning of this year, what happened to RIN prices. So if that should happen, you could see RIN prices go back up again. Some smaller and merchant refiners will have a difficult time paying their RIN tax, their RIN bill, and may decide to curtail operations. Gasoline and diesel exports will definitely continue to increase. We'll see that more and more as much as possible. Advanced biofuels will have to fill in the blend fall shortfall, and those are obviously higher priced fuels than corn ethanol. You'll see foreign renewable fuel imports will increase. So where sugarcane ethanol was more disadvantaged, now you'll see that play a bigger role as it has historically. We could see soy methyl ester from Argentina, palm methyl ester from Asia. We could see rapeseed methyl ester coming in from Europe. It's because when EPA approves a pathway, that is a worldwide pathway. So as long as I can trace the crop back to the field where it was grown, I can make a fuel out of that product and bring it to the U.S. Okay, pump prices may increase because if RIN prices stay at $1 or more, that could be one of the consequences, and you'll see strong corn and soybean prices. So what EPA does in the next few weeks is going to have a very interesting impact on this overall market. And so that's my presentation today about RINs. I hope you feel like you're really smart about RINs. Oh, I have one other thing to mention, and that is if you saw this little guy at the table out front, this is Weaver's mascot for the RFS program. It's a rhinoceros. And his name is Warren, and he is a D7, which now you know is a cellulosic diesel RIN. So be sure to get one of these before you leave today. Thank you very much.